Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event on why college costs so much and what states can do about it. My name is Michael Van Beek, and I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center, and we are very happy to have you with us today. We have a great panel discussion for you today on this topic, and I'm going to be asking questions of the panelists throughout, and it'll be sort of a relaxed discussion about higher education costs and what kind of reforms we could potentially look at to fix or improve the situation as it stands. But the audience, those of you who are tuned in, can also ask questions of the panelists. So there is a Q&A box that you should be able to see on your screen. You can type questions into that box, and the panelists may respond to them in the box, in the text box, but I will also look at those questions, and towards the end of the event, for the last 15 minutes or so, I will draw questions from the audience and ask those of the panelists as well. So please, if you have a question, jot it down in that Q&A box, and we will try to address it. And any questions we don't answer, we'll try to get a response one way or the other, maybe through an email after the event is over. Before we start with our panel, though, I want to introduce Joe Lehman. Joe is the president of the Mackinac Center, and he started with the center in 1995 and became its president in 2008, and he's going to give us a brief update on what's happening at the Mackinac Center. So take it away, Joe.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to Mackinac Center friends and supporters who are joining the show here this morning. This week, or last week, the Mackinac Center published its list of legislative recommendations for 2021. And I will make sure that we post a link to that in the chat box so that everyone can grab it if they want to download it quickly. And it's been a strange year to lay out a legislative agenda because the pandemic continues and the lockdowns continue. But those who are familiar with the Mackinac Center's work will see some familiar themes. It is most important among our policy recommendations that we take advantage of this moment to expand educational options for kids. The lockdowns have put on full display the K-12 system's challenges in fulfilling its duty for the students of Michigan. Parents' frustration levels are off the chart, and many of the kids are suffering real harm, particularly the ones who went into the lockdowns starting with some vulnerability. So we will be looking for ways, with a great deal of vigor, we'll be looking for ways to expand options for kids. And we think we'll have the attention of the public and lawmakers like never before. Also, 2021 would be a terrible year to continue spending money on corporate welfare in Michigan. Now, there's never a good year to do that, but this is particularly a bad year when there are so many other needs related to the pandemic. We're also seeing opportunities to get traction on laws and regulations related to the practice of medicine. And again, the pandemic really shined a light on how counterproductive some of our regulations were. This is why Governor Whitmer last year, actually, she agreed with some Mackinac Center recommendations and wrote executive orders that relaxed the standards for medical facilities that used to have to get government permission slips to do things like add new beds or install pieces of equipment. And she also relaxed the standards for practicing medicine by video and by phone for obvious reasons. And also she made it easier for medical professionals to expand their scope of practice so that one medical professional could treat more people in more ways, in ways that had been restricted before. So we had that moment of agreement from Governor Whitmer last year. She said publicly that these measures saved lives, but the governor has backtracked on some of them and actually made all those areas more difficult for medical professionals and for patients. That's one reason that factored into our thinking when we had to sue the governor last year, and a case which we won at the Michigan Supreme Court. But there's still winning that lawsuit did not fix everything, and so we'll be continuing to work to get more permanent fixes in place through the legislature. And lastly, in our booklet on legislative recommendations for 2021, you'll see that we are still championing government transparency. When government refuses to release information that the public owns, that's government keeping secrets. And except in some very narrow cases, that's not appropriate. Government should not have secrets from the public. And we are seeing the fallout from bad policy on this, or at least bad practice on this, in New York. Governor Cuomo in New York is completely embroiled right now in a scandal, I have to say, of his own making, when one of his close aides admitted to some legislators in New York that they had actually hidden data related to the number of people his policies sent to nursing homes where the COVID virus just rampaged through nursing homes and caused many thousands of deaths. And for whatever reason, he and his administration decided to try to keep that data secret. Now it has come out. And so Michigan needs much better laws on the executive and the legislative branch, the legislature and the governor's office, to make sure that our government officials have every incentive to act in the public interest, because they know that the public can keep an eye on them. On Monday, we released a report called How the Electricity Grid Works in Michigan. And it may look like we're geniuses on timing. I guess we are geniuses on timing, but this time we got lucky because of the bad luck in Texas. The Texas electricity grid is experiencing rolling blackouts now due to, depending on who you talk to, it's due to the cold weather. But it's also due in part to the fact that they have switched so much of their grid capacity to less reliable sources such as windmills and solar, that they simply can't fire up the power plants the way they used to get electricity to people's homes. So now with sub-zero temperatures and snow conditions in Texas where they're not used to that, there are people going without heat and light. And this is a direct cause of bad policy in electricity generation. And we can learn a lot from that. Our colleague Jason Hayes has written a report which you can find front and center on our website. And lastly, we want you to know that the new Congress has plans for Michigan on when it comes to labor policy. There is there's an act called the PRO Act, which is up for consideration in the Congress. And it is really a grab bag of some of the worst ideas in labor policy that we can think of. And leading the list is a provision that would outlaw right to work in all the states where right to work is the law. And so, of course, that means Michigan too. That would affect private sector unions much more than public sector unions if that were to come to pass. Now, I'm actually fairly optimistic that the worst provisions of the PRO Act probably won't get through an evenly divided Senate. Not every Democrat will go along with all of those provisions, even though Democrats control the chamber. But it's still something that we have to keep an eye on, because even though a lot of our focus is not on Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. can make policy that affects Michigan in a big way. So today I'm very excited to hear about how to lower the cost of college, because I've still got some kids in college. And Mike, I'll turn it back over to you for the rest of the show. And thank you to all the Mackinac Center friends and supporters for joining us today and for supporting us.
Thanks, Joe. Let me get our panel introduced here. We have a panel of three, and all of their names starts with J, so forgive me if I make any mistakes. The first panelist that I'll introduce is Jason Delisle. He is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on higher education financing with an emphasis on student loan programs. His work focuses on the history and mechanics of federal student loans and financial aid policies, and he was an informal advisor on higher education reform for Governor Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign. Seems like a very long time ago that Jeb Bush was running for president. Jason has a master's degree of public policy from George Washington University. Also with us is Jeremy Horpedahl. He is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Central Arkansas and a scholar at the Arkansas Center for Research in Economics. He received his PhD from George Mason University. And last, we have Jarrett Skorup, who is the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Mackinac Center, where he has studied higher education issues for many years. And he doesn't have as many fancy degrees as our other two panelists, but he has a heavily prized degree from Grove City College. So thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Jeremy, I'd like to start with a question for you, and it's a big one. So if the other panelists want to weigh in on this as well, feel free. But Jeremy, I thought you could start us off by explaining the primary causes of the increasing cost of higher education.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm down in Arkansas and happy to join you. We're also experiencing rolling blackouts here, so we're having some grid issues too. But I think they said they're going to stop those for now, so I can do this call. But so yeah, I think there's two things we could talk about this, right? Like, why does college cost as much as it does? And then also, why has it been increasing, right? So I think those are two related questions. We might think about them differently. Me as a professor, I think about this a lot as someone who's in this business and also has kids who are going to college soon. And I think, partially I'm to blame, right? One of the major costs of supplying higher education is the salaries of faculty and staff. So both those salary costs, but also providing benefits that for most colleges, this is going to make up well over half of their budget. And if you look at the increases, even though many of my colleagues at the university might complain about our miserly raises we get every year, we actually are compensated well, and there's a lot of increases that are associated with employing people that don't show up in your salary, with benefits and paying payroll taxes and all sorts of other things. So that's, I think, a big part of it, and that's something where I think there's a real challenge. Of course, we'll get into this over the next hour of, how do you control that? There are a number of other possible explanations, right? So, and I think we can also maybe distinguish between the price of college, which is what, the consumers, the students pay, and the cost of college, which is the cost of, putting on the production. If we look at, why one reason the price has gone up, at least in some states, this isn't universally true, and I think Jason can speak a little more to this with his research, is in some states, at least in the past decade, there's been declining funding for students, as far as state support. Now, this isn't true in every state, and it's not true if you look over a really long time period, but certainly in the last decade, many states have seen declining funding. What that means is that more of the cost is then put on the users, on the consumers, the students. As an economist, I think that's not such a bad thing if the people who are going to be benefiting from college, which are, there are certainly some social benefits from college, but the benefits of college mostly go to the users, the ones that get the degrees. And so if they're paying more for it, I cringe a little since I have children myself, but if they pay more, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Rather than more of the cost being shouldered by taxpayers, especially if we're thinking about public colleges. There's one other possible explanation, and that's that government support itself is the reason that costs are going up. So as governments make student loans more accessible and more generous, as Pell Grants increase, as state aid increases, some colleges might try to use this to increase their costs of providing it and then pass those costs along in the form of price increases for students. There's been a lot of research on this. This goes under the name the Bennett hypothesis, after former Secretary of Education proposed this, I think, in the late 1980s. And there's been a lot of research done on this, and most of it that I've looked at has found that certainly cannot explain all of the cost increase. It could perhaps, in some cases, for some programs, explain maybe 10 to 20%, but that's not the big thing. I think the big thing really is just the cost of employing all the people. And so we can maybe talk about, are they employing the right people, too many people, the wrong kinds of people? Those are all, I think, really good questions. But I would say, I think that's my short version of the answer, if that's short enough. But I think it's a really good question. Hope we come back to that a lot more today.
Yeah, Jason, would you like to add anything to what Jeremy just said there?
Yeah, I might go in maybe a little bit of a different direction. Some of the work that I've done recently with the American Enterprise Institute looks at available financial aid in our higher education system. Now, I realize I'm talking to folks from Michigan right now. Most of my data and the studies that I focus on are using national information, so it's not going to be Michigan specific. But some of the themes that have been motivating my work recently is to sort of push for free college, or a federal free college plan. This is what President Biden has proposed. And what I think is interesting is it's sort of a tacit admission that our current system of financial aid doesn't work, at least from the federal government, right? So the proposal for free college, if you sort of look under the hood, is a large new funding formula from Washington, where states would have to match the amount of money. There would be from the state's perspective, like a $1 for every $2 or $3 that the federal government kicks in to provide free college. This is a sort of radical paradigm shift in how the federal government has supported college prices and college tuition and helping people pay for college. Historically, it's been a voucher, a grant, the Pell Grant program, and increasingly large tax credits. And this system is something completely different. It looks more like how the federal government pays for K-12 than it does how they historically have paid for higher education. So what I wanted to do in response to this sort of free college agenda was say, well, because this is it seems like a tacit argument that the financial aid system doesn't work and we need something completely different and we need free, how has financial aid stacked up? So I have a paper out. You can get it on the American Enterprise Institute website. It's called Evidence Against the Free College Agenda, where we looked at the prices that students and families pay to attend public universities, the tuition prices that they pay after all of their financial aid is factored in. And what we realized when we do this study is that in the United States, we have a very large, very generous system of financial aid. So much so that the average tuition that students are paying at four-year public institutions, after all their student aid is factored in, is a little over $2,000 a year, which is a lot different than the kinds of numbers you hear out there, right? A little over $2,000 a year in tuition after all student aid. And this is for families earning under $125,000 a year. This is the kinds of families that the free college advocates are targeting. Now here, I'll leave you with this sort of point. I'll just kind of wrap up on this. That price, that net price, net of student aid, hasn't really changed in about 20 to 25 years. So the price that families are paying to attend an in-state public university, low-income and middle-income families, the tuition price after their student aid, really hasn't changed.
Well, that is surprising for me, even looking at these issues probably somewhat more closely than the average person, for sure. I'm wondering how that relates to the growth of student debt, though, and that has skyrocketed as well. So I wonder, Jarrett, if you could talk a little bit about student debt. Why has that grown so much, and how big a problem is that issue?
Yeah, so I think I agree for the most part with both of these guys. I would say one thing that was not discussed and that is less talked about is there's just cultural reasons that have changed and affected the price of colleges and the debt people take. So, for example, we just have a lot more people over the last couple decades that are going to college. And what that's resulted in is that we haven't had this huge increase in the number of colleges. And so we have roughly the same number of colleges, more students going. So why is tuition increase? Why have costs increased? Why have revenue increase? Because it can. I mean, if there's the same number of grocery stores and you get more people going to grocery stores, the price is going to increase. It's just a supply and demand issue. On the debt issue specifically, a lot of what you read in the media is focused, I think, on the wrong problem. You just hear these stories of people with six-figure debt, and that's just really atypical. The debt that I would worry about and that has become an increasing issue in the United States, and I don't, whether this is how big of a problem it is, we can discuss. But where it is a problem is those areas where you have people that are middle class or lower middle class or low income who go to college and never finish. And nowadays, that's 40% of our student population. And so if you've got $60,000, $70,000 worth of debt, but you have a degree, you're probably going to be okay. If you have $10,000 or $20,000 worth of debt and you don't have a degree and you spent 2 years there, that's really where the issue is. And that's the kind of debt that ends up snowballing. And that's the debt that hasn't.
We've already sort of broached this topic a little bit, but Jason, I think one of the things that you said that was interesting about President Biden's plan is it would sort of simplify potentially the way funding for higher education works. It's a bit frightening to me that you say it would work more like K-12 because we don't have good cost controls on K-12 spending either. Those costs have just increased as well. But I wonder if any of you could talk more and explain about why college funding and prices why it's so complicated. Jason's research suggests that the sticker prices that we see on college tuition on their web pages are just, they're not things that real people pay on average. So why is it so complicated, and what can we do about that?
So, I think that one of the reasons why it's so complicated is because we've tried to design a system, and I would argue we've actually been pretty successful at it, but the consequence is that it's complicated. We try to design a system that has progressive pricing and targets aid to people who need it and doesn't really provide it to people who don't, meaning high income. So what we have is this, and we also have multiple funders. So states provide grants, the institutions themselves provide discounts on the tuition price, the federal government provides Pell Grants, and the federal government also provides tuition tax credits. And there's also student loans, but I'm not even talking about loans because that doesn't reduce your price, it just helps you pay. And so the idea here is that you design a system where the student shows up and then sort of reveals what their ability is to pay. And we have a patchwork system of grants and tax credits that tries to reduce that price for them based on their income. So a good friend of mine, Alex Usher in Canada, who is an expert on international higher education, he looks at this, he looks at the US system and says, oh, yeah, absolutely. He says, the US higher education system is not ungenerous, but it is opaque, right? I mean, that's his point about the complicated pricing system that we have, but it's coming from good intentions, and I would argue that it sort of works. Families pay different prices. I'll just finish on this. I actually think most of the anxiety around college costs and prices is being driven by upper middle class and upper income families, because they're the ones where the institutions of higher education have sort of price discriminated heavily, where that's who they're jacking up prices on in an effort to keep prices low for lower middle income and low income families.
I would say, just speaking about Michigan specifically, so Michigan funds its universities in a way that makes this a problem. So essentially, we have 15 public universities, and the legislature gives them appropriations every year, and those appropriations are not really based on anything. They're only tangentially connected to transparency requirements or how successful the schools are, or going to low-income kids, or any of those things that you would normally think about. So we just flat out give subsidies, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Then you have what Jason talked about, where you have these tax credit and these programs where the federal government is essentially funding students. And that just ends up where and then of course you have listing prices that are a lot higher than what people ultimately pay. And so universities are kind of, on the one hand, they get the state subsidies in Michigan, they get the federal subsidies, and they get grants from students. And they also have where they're balancing high income students who are paying or international students who are paying very high tuition costs versus middle class who are getting more help, versus the low income who might be getting almost completely paid for, but who don't have a high chance of finishing. And that just ends up with this system that they're trying to manage. And the makeup of those students is very different for every university.
Yeah, I think I agree with what the other two J's are saying here on a lot of these issues. Let me just try to add a little bit. This difference that both of you guys spoke about the posted price, the sticker price, the list price, versus what students actually pay, which in the literature we call the net price. That the net price is just so much lower. I think I know we want to talk most about public colleges, but for private colleges, it's almost out of control. That some private nonprofit colleges give discounts to 100% of their students, and these are not token amounts. They're $8,000-9,000 that not a single person, with the exception in some cases of international students, actually pays the sticker price. And that average discount rates are something like 56% and 90% of all private students get it. Now for publics, it's not as bad, and it's, I think, as Jason said, done for a potentially good reason, right? That we're trying to increase access based on students' families' income and assets. But I think that this just makes it so complex that there's there's a whole cottage industry out there of people selling books that will try to help you plan. This is one that just came out. The price you pay for college. It's like 300 pages of explaining to you, how to pick a college and how to get the best price. And, as an economist, this still makes sense. Price discrimination, right? We're going to see how much you're willing to pay. But I mean, for a public university to be price discriminating to this extent, I think it's just crazy, right? So we got to think about why are they doing this. But if you think about, the big one in Michigan, at Ann Arbor, the tuition fees, room and board is about $31,000 a year for an in-state student. But when you look at after discounts, it's about $16,000. So it's about, even at the University of Michigan, it's about a 50% discount. Now, this is not all bad, but I think we need to think seriously about, what is the goal of that? Should there be any kind of guide rails or regulations on how public colleges do this pricing? All colleges now have these net price calculators you can go through on their website and figure it out. But even those are very long and complex. I think more transparency in pricing. I think the analogy to healthcare, I think, is good here again, that there's just no transparency in that. A lot of it's being paid for by people other than the student or the parent, which in some cases is good to increase access, but it just makes the whole process so complex. And even for me who's in the business, it's hard for me to sometimes figure out, what exactly is going on. And a lot of schools, I think, because I've talked to the admissions departments at several different colleges I've worked at, including a small private college, and they say, well, people like to feel like they're getting a discount, right? You want to say, I go to the school that costs this much, but I got the secret discount, right? But everyone's getting the secret discount, right? Or at least most people are, except for the very high income people. And I think that's just the marketing. My friends in marketing would say this is a great tactic, but as an economist, I say this seems like a bad strategy overall. So thinking about how we can make that better, I think would go a long way towards certainly at least reducing the public's frustration with the cost of college if it was more transparent, and might allow us to have a more reasonable discussion, since most discussions of this in the public sphere, I think, are based around just the increase in the sticker price. And oh my goodness, that's very misleading. And so hopefully we can maybe think of some ways to improve that. But I'll yield my time for now.
Well, I'm wondering if if the other two panelists have ideas for how we might make a situation where we have colleges. I think it's particularly striking that it's colleges doing it. What kinds of things could the public policy to make the system more transparent for consumers, and so that students and parents know and have a more realistic opportunity to figure out weigh the cost and benefits of these programs.
Not quite directly answer your question, but this is actually one of the things that is driving the free college sort of agenda, is that the price is it's just too complicated, and nobody knows what they're going to be paying. And what it's done is it's deterred a lot of people from going. But if there's so much student aid money there already, and the prices are actually so much lower than the sticker price, then it's not going to take that much more to get to free, at least in terms of tuition. So let's just call it free, and then everybody knows what it costs. And you can see how that's sort of dangerously appealing. But that's how they've gotten there, is actually sitting around having the same discussion that we're having. And they, meaning the people who are very much so in favor of free college. I think that's something for, folks on the political right as well to be aware of, though, because I think they're likely to fall into a similar trap, which is this is just too complicated and not transparent. Let me get in there and fix it. Let me tell you how it should work. And that's why I think this, on the federal government's point of view, the sort of voucher approach is something now that very much so needs to be defended, because it's sort of under attack for being too complicated and not transparent enough.
Yeah, there's kind of two key distortions here that could be solved, one easier than the other. On the one hand, Jeremy talked about, just give the straight list price. The other thing that's important is not all colleges and universities are the same. You're going to get much more bang for your buck from some than you will from others. And so I think we've been moving that in that direction, but giving the total cost of college, not just tuition, but all the fees and the room and board and that types of thing. And then what are the kind of bangs of the bucks that we're getting? And specifically, things like graduation rates, things like how much earnings are after a certain number of years, broken down by major, broken down by the income level of those different groups. I mean, those are things that would be helpful, and especially that lawmakers can actually judge how universities are doing. Because frankly, we have a lot of colleges and universities where their model is really, they're not getting a ton of higher income students. They're limited in how many middle-class students they can get, and a lot of their model is just based around the state subsidies and the federal money coming in, and they're existing based on those, which is to say they're not doing a great job. But the other thing gets back to, it's the cultural point. There are a lot of people where the goal is just, I need to get my kid to college, and by college they mean a 4-year bachelor's degree at these schools. And that's really just not the way to think about the issue. I mean, if you're a student and you say, I don't really know what I want to do, but I want the college experience, at least that's something. But I know my dad wouldn't pay for the college experience. He wants to know, what job are you getting? What are you going to do with it? And how is that going to make you better off in life? And so I think a lot of this really has to be cultural, where we're more willing to allow students to take a gap year or two to find other jobs that they're working on. And those are the things where you're going to cut down on the people I worry about, which is the 40% of people who start and never finish. But that has to come more from a culture than from public policy.
Yeah, it also strikes me that so much of the push for free college, is rooted in the idea that college is good for everybody. So if you go to college, you will earn more money, and everyone will benefit in society from that. I'm wondering if you all can push back against that some and discuss what are some of the potential negative consequences of making college more affordable, or to the extreme end, making it free to the user.
I'm a little bit sympathetic to the argument of there are individuals who feel pressure to go to college, but it's not the best thing for them. And we've also pursued a system that is very much so open enrollment. Our higher education system, there is a college pretty much for everybody somewhere, and so, but one thing I worry about, and like I said, I'm sympathetic to that, and I think that there's certainly, I think the way of addressing that is helping consumers understand their choices and what's best for them. What I worry about is, particularly because I think this can be appealing for folks on the right, on the political right, is to decide who should go to college and who shouldn't, right? And that's something I think that conservatives should sort of run away from and prevent from happening. What we don't want is student aid programs that decide, who is worthy of a college degree and who isn't, right? Because now you have the government picking winners and losers, and that's something that conservatives don't like. And I've watched time and time again my friends on the political right who this is where they go there. They say, let's have and this is actually I actually have a sort of like cynical op-ed that I've wanted to write for a long time but can't quite pull the trigger on it, which is that Republicans and conservatives could really learn to like free college. And here's how they could get there. Under free college, universities can't raise revenue by charging tuition. They're beholden entirely to their state government, all of their revenue. Therefore, their state legislature controls them entirely. Then they can strangle them, right, by cutting off the revenue and shrink them. And when universities shrink seats, they ration access. And how do they ration access? They raise their academic standards. So there you have it. You have a shrunken university system that costs less, where standards are very high and only the best students get to go. That's actually what free college looks like in a lot of socialist European countries. So you can see, right, how, right, and so, and when you have high academic standards, who gets to go to college? Oh, the highest income students who had the best K-12 experience and tutors, right? So this is dangerous. So I feel like, on this line of thought, like conservatives should say, I think they want to support an open access system, but I think it's also important to beat the drum that, we need a lot of options for students, and we need less pressure for the most expensive, selective, 4-year degree. But in terms of the government policy, we probably want it to be less restrictive rather than more.
Yeah, from my standpoint, the problem is that we will double down if you for going to free college or more government support, is that we will double down on the current issues, which is we will get more people that are going to college that should not start. And by college, I mean a traditional 4-year degree. We will end up subsidized, because we do a lot of subsidies that are aimed at low-income students. We're going to expand that to middle class, upper middle class, and higher income students. And that's, from an economic standpoint, that's just not a good idea. So policymakers need to say, what are we actually trying to do here? And we spend way too much time focused on, we need to get everybody to college and get them a degree, rather than the lower point, which is we have a lot of people going to college. How do we make sure that they're actually getting the training and the education that they need to be successful in life? And I think we spend plenty of money on that to solve that problem, rather than just getting more people into the system.
I think one thing that might be useful to think about, I don't know how much Michigan does of this already, but thinking about both funding formulas and the information that incoming students have is, to get them really good information about this was mentioned earlier. I mean, there is information out there about which majors pay the most and so on and so forth. But I think students just really don't have this information. I mean, I present to my students sometimes, and they're kind of shocked just at the differences in what different majors pay when you eventually get a job. And so I think that making sure that people are going to college for reasons that will benefit themselves in the long run. I think I've already said, okay, it's too complex, but maybe this is a complexity that would be good, is just providing more information about what's the return on investment. And in a college of business, of course, we're totally comfortable with this, and we're totally happy talking about it because our salaries are some of the highest. But my colleagues across campus and in other disciplines, they don't want to talk about this at all. Now, some of that's due to the fact that their majors might pay less, but also they just think that's not what college is about, right? That college is about an experience. It's about becoming a more well-rounded human being, and I think that that's part of it. But I think that most families, especially in a place like Michigan or Arkansas, that's not what they're looking for. They see this as a path to a higher standard of living after they graduate. And so giving people information on that, and potentially having your funding formula based on some sort of outcomes like that. Arkansas, we just tweaked we didn't just tweak it, we kind of revamped our funding formula for public universities about 4 years ago. So we're just now starting to kind of see the effects of that. But before it was just based on, butts and seats, how many students do you have, and that determines your subsidy. They've now tried to make it more based on some outcomes, graduation rates, both 4 and 6 year graduation rates, employment rates of graduates. I don't know, because it's fairly new. I don't think we know exactly how it's going to shake out, but I think maybe our other two panelists might have some information on how this has worked out in other states. But I think that's something that's worth thinking about. Why is the state supporting higher education at all, right? I think there are two main reasons. One is that they do research which has benefits for all of society, right? That's one thing public universities do. But for 4-year undergraduate colleges, that's not most of what they're doing, right? That's what's being done in the graduate programs. That's what's being done by the faculty at research universities. Most of the justification, I think, today publicly for supporting higher education is that this is a way to get people to be better trained for better jobs so that it benefits them, not so that it benefits society. And so if that is today the main public policy justification, we need to think about whether schools are actually doing that, or whether they're providing some other experience which might be nice for the students but really has no policy justification.
Actually ties right in with the next question I wanted to ask, first starting with Jarrett, and then after this question I'll get to several of the ones that have been asked by the audience. But Jarrett, one of the things that we've seen in Michigan a lot is that spending on higher education is viewed by some as an economic development tool for the state, as it's, we need to give public universities more money so that the state's economy will grow. Can you talk about what your thoughts are on that? And Jeremy and Jason, if you want to weigh in too, feel free.
There's some legitimacy to that, but I would just have that as a completely separate thing. I mean, the problem now is, in Michigan, we have a couple of huge research institutions, the University of Michigan being the most prominent. And so, okay, let's have a debate about, are we putting money into R&D that University of Michigan is doing, or the hospital system, or whatever. But then we have all these other ancillary fights where we're tying that to tuition for some reason. And those are just completely separate things. They're separate discussions. My point just overall is, look, we've been doing increasing federal subsidies for 40 years, 50 years in the United States across the board. Tuition has been increasing. Revenue has been increasing. Universities are finding ways to spend that, either by adding administrators, more so than professors, adding these other classes into new areas. I mean, if you go back decades, if you want to be a construction worker, you weren't looking at a college, a liberal arts college to do construction, but we have that as a program nowadays. And those things are just where it's kind of a mission creep of these different universities. And I don't think overall that's leading to more economic development. We were getting that more efficiently in the past, and now because of this creep, we're doing it, but we're doing it in a more expensive manner than we used to do.
I wonder if I could just come back to something really quick from sort of the beginning before we go into questions. Because I'm sure some people are wondering, I mentioned early on about how there's student aid, because you have this generous student aid system, that tuition prices at public universities really haven't gone up in 20 to 25 years. And I'm sure that people are wondering, well, wait, but why do I hear all of this about student debt? I mean, student debt has gone up a lot. It's $1.5 trillion right now. And it used to be, 20 years ago, it used to be $350 billion. So how do you square those two things? And I wanted to make sure that folks sort of could hear me out on this, because I think it's a misperception. I think that the connection between tuition prices, particularly those at public universities, and student debt is very, very weak. When you look at the amount of student debt that's out there, first of all, almost half of it paid for graduate professional school. So that giant $1.5 trillion number, half that's graduate and professional school. I mean, we're not, so, no one's out there trying to decide, how can we help people? How can we help doctors and lawyers? Oh, I guess some people are. Some of my friends on the left are very concerned about helping them. But anyway, and so really, I mean, this whole college access and college affordability thing, half the student debt really has nothing to do with college. It's all master's degrees. And then a big chunk of the debt is for people going to private institutions. So it's not, and it's expensive private institutions. So I think those are important things, and also living expenses. I've done some research that shows that non-tuition expenses at universities have been increasing significantly faster than inflation. And I know that's not news to any of you. It may be the amenities issues, it may be lots of things, but that's a significant driver of student debt as well that financial aid isn't going to touch or address. So I just wanted to make sure that folks are aware. I'm not saying the student debt issue is not an issue. It is. It is just not, I think, being driven by tuition, particularly tuition at public.
Thank you for that additional information. I was wondering about, so that is good to know. I'm going to get to some of the questions that we have from the audience. One of them is about a phenomenon I've heard about recently too, which is the increase in administration costs at universities as being one of the main drivers that is requiring raising their sticker prices. So I wonder if you could address that particular issue. Are colleges just hiring on new administrators and getting away from their core function too much? Is that part of the problem?
So they are, but it works in reverse, in my opinion. So they, like in Michigan, we've had Dr. Horpedahl mentioned, some states have cut back on higher ed. It's kind of just a big expense ratio, and if you get a tough economy, that is an area where they pull back, and universities make it up with tuition hikes. But the interesting thing about that in Michigan is revenue increases at our universities have just kept going up very gradually, totally regardless of what revenue they're getting from the state is. And so that kind of pushes towards the point of, all right, we get less revenue from the state, maybe we hike tuition, except the tuition hikes have also been very steady. So the point is they make up revenue in different ways, but in my opinion, they get this set amount of revenue and they find ways to spend it. Universities are nonprofits. They got to find a way to spend it. They don't have stockholders or something that they have to reward. And so the way they do that is they add faculty or they raise the salaries of those faculty. And so I think that the administrative costs are finding just new ways to spend the increasing amount of money that they're getting in from increasing numbers of students or revenue from the state and federal government.
I would just throw out there too, though, to be the skunk at the garden party on this, but I talk a lot with folks about the higher education prices and some of the literature and some of the data I look at. I mean, people tend to choose the more expensive option when they can. we see that higher income families gravitate towards more expensive schools. Right, and what I think my sort of flip way of putting this is Americans are really mad about their expensive higher education system, and they would have it no other way. Which is, people don't want to go to a bare bones college. So I think there's a lot of, Jeremy talked about this a little bit at the beginning. I mean, there is, and Jarrett, you kind of mentioned it too. Like the consumer demand is there and strong. And so, it's tough. I think if you're running a university and you see that, you see the demand, you see the ability of people to pay, the willingness to pay, it's tough to sit there and say, gee, we gotta cut back.
That's a good point. And of course, it gets complicated when taxpayers are subsidizing that increased demand, right? So the demand is there from a certain segment of society, but all of us have to pay for it. So that complicates the issue, to say the least. Another question that we have from the audience is, there's a couple here that I'm kind of fusing together, but they're essentially about mission creep that was sort of mentioned earlier. But is that one of the drivers of the increased cost of college, that their colleges are too busy trying to do a whole smorgasbord of offerings, giving students the opportunity to do all kinds of things instead of focusing in maybe more on what life skills, work skills they might need. They don't focus very often on what the local labor market is demanding, those sorts of things. Is that part of what is driving these costs upward?
There's something to keep in mind over all this, above all else, which is about 35% of American adults have a college degree, and only about a little bit more than half of college or of high school students go to college. So we're talking about a huge percent of people that don't have the college degree, and there's a huge percentage of people that aren't going to college at all. That number's going down, but it's still very significant. So universities and colleges have this incentive to try to get more and more of those students. And I don't think that they do that in a very efficient way. I think it does drive up costs. And I think that's just something that we're going to see increasing amounts of. There's this idea when I hear when I'm in conversations, people have this idea that like we need to get more kids to college, and that's how we get more engineers and STEM people or whatever the latest fad is. That's not really how it works. People who are highly intelligent or maybe capable and interested in those jobs are going to do those jobs. There are also highly intelligent people that maybe they'd rather go run their own business, maybe they'd rather be a contractor or something else, and they're going to go do those jobs. It's really, really difficult to take somebody that is like a borderline high school dropout and turn them into an engineer or something. But that seems to be this idea that goes around in our culture. And to Jason's point, or to Jeremy's point, that's led more to this increase in all these other areas that are, psychology degrees and sociology and very general degrees that are less likely to actually be used by the person in the course of their career, which means we're paying a lot of money, but we're really not getting the economic benefits out of those people going and getting a degree.
Jason or Jeremy, you have anything to add? Go ahead, Jeremy.
I'll just add quickly, I think as far as, whether mission creep and the offerings of the college are driving costs, I don't know necessarily if it's driving costs, but it's hard for people that aren't in university to realize this, just how much faculty governance and faculty choosing what programs are available, that really does drive a lot of it. Now, some of my colleagues will claim we don't have enough, there's too much administrative control, but really the faculty control a lot of that. And a lot of faculty just are happy adding new programs. And Michael, you said something like local labor market demand. I mean, that phrase would never, ever come up in these conversations about what programs and majors we should be offering, unless an economist is in the room. And we try not to serve on committees. So, that certainly exists. And I think we need to think about that, and especially think about for public universities, whether degrees that are being offered make sense for the public to be subsidizing them. If universities want to offer degrees that don't have, that don't meet local labor market demand, but, have the users pay for it, I think there's nothing I see no problem with that. But I think this question of whether the public should be supporting is a good one. I don't know how much that's driving the cost, though. It's really just more driving what major students choose, and maybe attracting some more students that want those programs. But most students come to college not knowing what they want to major in, or they change it at some point.
We have time for just one last question, and try to make the responses brief here. Sorry, it's kind of a large question, but it has to do with putting you on the spot here, giving you a challenge. It has to do with, I'm reminded of Clayton Christensen, who wrote a book a while ago about disruptive innovation. And he kind of predicted that this would happen in higher ed. And when you have things like Khan Academy and all these online free courses, and the cost to transmitting information and knowledge has just been reduced to near zero across the world. What do you guys think of those kinds of technology, or that whole idea that higher education may eventually be disrupted by newcomers who figure out a cheaper, quicker, more effective way to provide students with what they want out of a college degree or college experience?
I'll just say briefly, I think if it's ever going to happen, I think it's going to happen now. I think we've had a year where a lot of schools have went online, and these predictions about something like that taking over have been around for decades, even before you had the internet and Khan Academy. I mean, since the 70s, that you can get information much more easily. I think what I would say as an economist when I think about this is that employers are expecting you to get a college degree, not just so you can learn information that's then transmitted directly to the job. They're trying to learn particular things about you as a person, such as, do you show up on time? Are you a rule follower? Do you have what it takes to, complete a degree that's somewhat challenging, right? I mean, people drop out of college. It's not easy. This tells you something about someone. The labor market is looking for information. This isn't just about, did you learn, the Pythagorean theorem, right? I mean, that's not what employers want to know. They want to know personality characteristics about you, and college is one way, a very expensive way, but is one way of demonstrating that. And so I think that Khan Academy, as wonderful it is, and I point my students to it all the time, I don't think that can ever replace all the things that a college degree is signaling to the labor market. So I would be skeptical of a total disruptive innovation, but I think more online classes are possible. But I'll give the other panelists some more time here. Sorry.
I'm going to tie this in with one of the questions in the chat where somebody asked, is there value in higher education beyond just creating taxpayers or getting employment? The things that all those technologies have made easier is it's way easier to learn a trade or get technical knowledge if you really want to. It's also way easier to have access to Plato and Aristotle and all these different books and all these different poets all over the world and things like that if you want to do that and become a better person. But for me, at the end of the day, for policymakers, they should care about the return on investment of what they're doing. And I don't think the system is doing a particularly good job right now. The most damning statistic that I've heard on this is in 1970, which is really the year we began doing federal subsidies for higher ed. 13% of college graduates were from low-income families. Today, about 7% of college graduates are from low-income families. So we're doing a worse job getting our poor families degrees despite all this spending. And that's a pretty damning statistic just overall.
I hate to end on damning statistics, but I think we have to. We're out of time. I want to thank our panelists for the discussion today, and thank you, audience, for your attention and participation with the questions. There were several on there that I did not get a chance to ask, so we will be trying to follow up with you later via email to get some of those answers from your questions. Before we close, I just wanted to let everyone know that this event, this virtual forum is recorded and will be online at the Mackinac Center's website at mackinac.org /events. And you can also, on that page, see future events that we have coming up that will be virtual for the foreseeable future. And also, if you like this event and are interested in learning more about the Mackinac Center, you can find out more about us at our website. And Mackinac Center is a nonprofit and relies entirely on contributions from private donors. And so if you would like to support our work, I ask that you consider that as well. So thank you very much again to our panelists. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.